Tombs and Treasure is mainly a first-person adventure game for the NES with some light RPG elements tossed into the mix. The backstory has ties to real-life locations in history, taking place in the Yucatan Peninsula at the ruins of Chichen Itza. After a professor studying the goings-on at the site goes missing, you take up the role of his daughter and her friend and set out on a search for answers about his disappearance by untangling the many mysteries of the ancient relics found there. As the game's introductory cutscenes play out, you learn that after the professor vanished, his research notes were found along with a few other items near the Well of Sacrifice. His notebook apparently got glued down to the table in the laboratory where you start out, because you're never able to pick it up in-game no matter how many times you try. They instead appear as a part of the instruction manual and are compellingly written, describing the tribulations and setbacks in the research along with some interpretations of the artifacts that were found in the different buildings. The dire undertones of the professor's words set the stage for what was about to unfold for my little party, but the information provided also served a secondary purpose. The entries are overflowing with clues for the riddles you'll face, and if you're playing Tombs and Treasure for the first time, they're a big help in clarifying how many of the small pieces of the mystery fit together. Like most other games in this vein, problem solving can be brute forced by trying every inventory item in action with everything else when you get stuck, but the notes pushed my thinking in the right direction and were a crucial part of my own success. Another important pack-in resource was a map of the ruins. You have to walk your group from site to site, and while it might not seem like a very complex area, the overhead view's visual experience can get pretty repetitive. Many of the landmarks are cut and pastes of the same building assets or bits of jungle, so it's surprisingly easy to get off track. There are some notable aspects though, and I applaud the design work that faithfully recreated several of the structures of Chichen Itza. The pixel art for these places is impressive, and will especially add to the immersion for anyone that's visited this area in the flesh. As someone who doesn't know much about the history of this place, I was grateful to have the major points of interest highlighted for me. It wouldn't have been hard to make my own map, especially considering the overall spectrum of video game map-making difficulty, but consulting the included one helped me in two very important ways. It supplied more hint fodder in the descriptions for each building, but it also identified notable areas to try to get into. The most confusing part about this overworld was figuring out whether or not you could access a particular structure to search it. Because of the steep angling of the viewpoint, doors were largely obscured or impossible to tell apart from other parts of the buildings. Moreover, entry points were really specific, like one easy-to-miss spot on the periphery of a water body, for example. Another thing working against you is the party's pathing. They're forced into taking certain routes through a screen's obstacles, which can also increase the likelihood of missing a door. There was one instance where I actually had no idea that a particular part of the ruins could be entered until I saw it labeled on the map. At that juncture in the game, a puzzle had directed me to a place with pillars, and I thought they meant the Temple of Warriors next door, which also has lots of them. After getting ravaged by a horrible fiend in there and unable to progress any further, I was stumped. I spent a long while revisiting other places, trying to see if I'd missed something else that I needed, but it wasn't until I checked the map and saw the Court of Columns as a location that everything clicked. When you're walking by that screen, there are no visual indicators to imply that you can go in. Without the map's indirect little nudge and walking over every pixel of that structure once I knew it was an important destination, I'm sure I'd still be stuck. When you venture inside a point of interest, the gameplay switches to a first-person mode where you're able to interact with the environment indoors. There's a very long list of actions to consider and choose from depending on what you come up against, but at first I didn't even realize that you could scroll the action bar to the left or right. I apparently missed this right on the back of the box. I found that the ease of use really suffered from the condensed layout of this little menu. There's so much room on the user interface that could have been taken advantage of, and expanding things to make finding and selecting actions easier would have gone a long way to smooth out the experience. The tiny symbols representing each action in their fuzzy composite quality would have been nearly impossible to decipher if not for the pictures in the manual, but the developers were at least kind enough to indicate each one's name in writing above the selection as well. I would have had a much worse time if I'd been forced to memorize what each of the individual symbols were. Action interface aside, the appearance of everything in these first-person sections was excellently crafted. Even with the muddy palette of the NES, they managed to create some visually impressive pixel art that highlighted key details in each scene. Looking more closely at items was really convenient since you're not stuck working with a freehand cursor. You can only scroll through a set number of objects, which removes some of the ambiguity about whether or not a gnarled pile of pixels is something you should be trying to interact with. Unfortunately, knowing what's in front of you is only a small part of the process, because even if you have a solution in mind, Tombs and Treasure will give you a hard time actually getting it done. There's a long list of actions to try, many of them very similar to one another. Pulling, pushing, moving, and using, for example, could have been the answer to many different problems, but only one of them will work. My biggest setback was never knowing if my thinking was wrong or if I just couldn't figure out the exact finicky way that the game wanted me to do something. A few times I thought I'd exhausted all my options and walked away from a puzzle, and only learned much later on that I was on the right track all along but wasn't able to read the game's mind. This became a deep source of frustration well into the adventure because missing certain puzzles earlier on can lead you to a soft lock down the line. Do you remember how in Sierra games you could accidentally do things to make them permanently unwinnable? Well, Tombs and Treasures flies that same evil flag, and it's impossible to know where you went wrong or what you're missing until it's far too late to fix it. I ran myself into dead ends a few times by combining items I needed to use separately and not being able to take them apart again, or wandering into a place that doesn't allow you to leave the same way you came for no good reason. I even got stuck after defeating the final boss because I was missing an item from hours earlier in the playthrough. Thankfully there's a password system, but it's atrocious. The codes are made up of every single character under the sun, but at least you can save anytime you want. Good luck remembering which one of the billion passwords you've written down is the one that you need though. At least PC adventure games let you name your files so that you have an idea of what you were doing at the time when you made the save. Here, you're stuck guessing wildly until you end up back at the right spot again. The sting of blindly reloading to the wrong point in the game is probably worse than just starting over. Once you know what you're doing, it's actually really fast to play through. The promise of turn-based fights with some neat-looking enemies was one of the things that initially drew me to this game, but they can only be described as anticlimactic because of how they were implemented. Progressing in Tombs and Treasure is completely locked in, so to speak, because you can't do things outside of the story's intended order. Experience to strengthen your character or increase the maximum hit points is won by completing puzzles in each leg of the game, while upgrades to weapon strength or defense come only from items that you find through exploration. If you stumble into a boss battle without the proper sword modifier or before you've completed all of the tasks required to move on, your fate is sealed before you even take the first swing. The only thing you can do is attack. There aren't any heals or special moves, but you're always guaranteed to be able to run if you need to. Thankfully, the battle prompts are good indicators for whether or not you'll win or lose. If you're badly injuring your foe, you'll probably win, but if you're only lightly damaging them, you might as well leave the area and go back to the drawing board about what else you might have missed before that point. There's absolutely no strategy involved, and that was a big letdown for me. For a while, I'd hoped that the other two party members would be involved in these encounters, since they're with you the entire time anyway, but it also turns out that they're yet another aspect of failed potential for this game. Other than offering up an occasional hint about what to do with new inventory items, the girl and the guide are only there for fixed tasks and events that tap into their limited skill sets. I won't say exactly what they can do because that's part of playing the game for yourself, but there are plenty of indicators in a few of the scenarios that let you know to switch to one of them before performing specific actions. And if you happen to be a big fan of being berated for your thinking sometimes, the girl's character is also great for hurting your feelings. She can get pretty rude. I don't want to say much about how Tombs and Treasure ends, except to stress that I didn't like it at all. The conclusion comes completely out of nowhere and left me with my jaw on the floor just like Phantasy Star 2 or Clash at Demon Head did. I shouldn't have expected much from a game where the main objective is to find someone that's gone missing without a trace, but I usually hope that an ending will at least line up with the tone of the overall experience, and this definitely did not. That's not to say that the story up until that point wasn't interesting. The only plot pieces you get are from the opening scenes and the instruction manual like I mentioned earlier, but there were a couple of curveballs here and there that intrigued me enough to want to keep playing. I think the music also served an important purpose other than just keeping me company while I furrowed my eyebrows at all of the riddles. It really went the extra mile to maintain the somber ambience and tension while perusing new venues and their creepy imagery. In the absence of character development and story twists, there was a thick layer of haunting immersiveness that came about from an excellent audiovisual experience. Tombs and Treasure has a number of traits that would normally add up to a fantastic game, but the execution in a couple of places made it feel more tedious than enjoyable at times. The spooky atmosphere and interesting puzzles are sometimes overshadowed by the awkward interface and the potential of a looming soft lock threatening many steps of the journey. I think it has a great foundation, but if more time had been spent refining a few of the major focuses, like the turn-based battles or even designing ways to allow players to get themselves out of dead ends, it would have improved the game immensely for me. Putting that aside, though, there's still plenty to experience here for people that appreciate games with a slower pace and want to take in the journey rather than rush to the destination. Once you know what you're doing and where many of the pitfalls are, it's a pleasant way to spend a few hours.